This is simple stuff, folks. This is all men are created equal. This is an embrace of the basic American creed. It is a creed that used to be called liberalism. And DEI is a rejection of that creed. Hey there, friends, fans, and foes of Dad Saves America. John Popola here. And I thought I would take this Friday to essentially do a part 2 from last Friday's video, in which we dissected why DEI is finally maybe going to DIE. But the one place where that will not be true, or perhaps will take a lot longer than in Walmart, is academia. And the reasons why, it turns out, are interesting and difficult for us to grapple with. And so I thought I'd take a look at the reasons why DEI will probably live on for a long time to come in the hallowed halls of our elite institutions of higher learning. And the whole constellation of thinking that surrounds it is a rejection not just of the American creed, but of Western civilization itself. Because, of course, we have been told by this DEI philosophy, by the people who espouse it, that Western society is fundamentally reprehensible. And the truth of the matter is that what the thing that constitutes the West, Western civilization, is, if nothing else, a long history of grappling with how do we elevate ourselves beyond the tribal nature of the human creature. That's what it is. The canon, the Western canon, the classical books, the great books, all of them teach us that we should judge each other not by the color of our skin, but the content of our character. And DEI says no. Judge people by what you can find out about them from across the room with your eyes. And I think we all are finally waking up to just how noxious and toxic and destructive this ideology is. It is an empirical failure on its own terms. And that is why the American voters, particularly Latin Americans and Black Americans in larger numbers than in modern history, rejected it at the ballot box for all the imperfections of the choice we faced on November 5th. In part, our election outcomes were a result of, as Morning Joe noted and Maureen Dowd from the New York Times was calling attention to, a rejection of this toxic, destructive, roto-fascist philosophy of DEI. But as Milton Friedman said with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the only place you'll find DEI advocates / Marxists is in the universities. This is where this philosophy came from. It is where it continues to thrive. And I think it's time we look a little closer at the reason why. This is hard stuff. And I want to take us to a place that's going to be uncomfortable, because I think we have to. Because if we're going to get past the destructive forces of DEI, we have to look reality in the face and have a conversation about what's going wrong and what to do about it. One of the things that's been driving this ideology to permeate our academic institutions and spread like a virus into corporate America and the broader culture is the feminization of the university. But don't take my word for it. Have a look.
The inclusion of women in higher education is a great achievement for Western liberal societies. Women are now supported and encouraged to pursue their intellectual interests, and it is clear that when they do so, they excel. How are these changes impacting academic culture, its priorities, policies, and norms, and shaping the direction of higher education and science? It is increasingly evident that men and women view the purpose of higher education and science differently, and that many emerging trends in academia can be attributed, at least in part, to the feminization of academic priorities. 2018 study of over 4,000 full-time college students on issues related to free speech on campus and diversity and inclusion found that 71% of men reported that protecting free speech is more important than promoting an inclusive society. 59% of women said promoting an inclusive society is more important than protecting free speech. 58% of men said that it is never acceptable to shut down speakers or to try to prevent them from delivering their remarks. 58% of women said that it was sometimes or always acceptable. A 2022 paper in which 574 undergraduates, graduates, and PhD students were asked to allocate 100 points towards 5 different academic priorities found that men allocated more points toward academic freedom and advancing knowledge than women, and women allocated more points towards social justice and emotional well-being than men. A 2021 paper found that male researchers were more likely to specify scientific progress or the advancement of knowledge as the aim of their research. Female researchers were more likely to specify societal progress or external usefulness as the aim of their research. The overall theme of these differences is that men are more committed than women to the pursuit of truth as the raison d'etre of science, when women are more committed to various moral goals, such as equity, inclusion, and the protection of vulnerable groups. Put more simply, men are relatively more interested in advancing what is empirically correct, and women are relatively more interested in advancing what is morally desirable.
Where have I heard this dichotomy before?
I think that there's a lot of people more concerned about being precisely, factually, and semantically correct than about being morally right.
But being factually correct is important.
It's absolutely important.
There's more to this, but I want to linger on this for a minute, because what it gets to is the question of why. Why does the university exist? What is its purpose? As the studies noted, DEI asserts, the people who advocate for DEI, I should say, assert a purpose, that it is to foster an inclusive environment, one that reduces racial tension, increases harmony. So you have a benchmark. This is their why they failed. The university as an institution, as a concept, puts forward the pursuit of truth and excellence as its reason to exist. You find veritas, truth, etched into stone at countless universities. You will find the pursuit of excellence, as mushy and squishy a phrase as that happens to be, all over every university's promotional materials. We promote excellence. Excellence at what? Excellence measured how? Well, that's obviously up for debate, but this is what these organizations purport to do. This is what they were, you could say, originally designed to try to do, to be hubs of knowledge and research, going back to the Greeks and Plato, straight through to the monks that preserved civilization during the Dark Ages and studied scholarship in monasteries that became the modern university, through to today. But putting moral truths that aren't technically factually correct doesn't exactly sound like the pursuit of truth. It sounds like the opposite. And so that is one of the reasons why we have seen a transformation in the nature of academia and the flourishing of DEI philosophy. As we sit here today, 60% of college graduates are now women. College graduates, PhD students, professors, they are all now majority female. And so the preference shifts on average between men and women are starting to have an increasingly profound effect on these institutions that we believe are supposed to be the hubs of the pursuit of truth, not the pursuit of feeling happy or feeling comfortable, the pursuit of truth, which often makes us unhappy and uncomfortable.
Some of the most drastic developments over the past 25 years share a common theme. They reflect the priorities of women. Some of these priorities include the introduction of diversity, equity and inclusion, DEI, committees and offices on university campuses, DEI programming and degrees, and a 34% increase in the spending of DEI budgets from 2014 to 2018.
And note that this is before the absolute bonanza post-2020. So it's all gone parabolic since this particular data was first captured.
The introduction of DEI commitment statements as a required part of job application materials for faculty members, which are more common in more female-dominated social science jobs than in more male-dominated STEM jobs. The introduction of safe spaces and trigger warnings on college campuses. The requirement now made by large professional societies, such as the Society for the Personality and Social Psychology, that presenters explain how their work advances equity and anti-racism, and the evaluation of presentations based on their ability to achieve these goals.
It's really important to understand this. There's people like James Lindsay and others who've been banging this drum for a long time. Christopher Rufo and America's Cultural Revolution book highlights this in a lot of depth and rigor, actually. This rot runs deep. The current teachers of our kids are being screened for whether or not they have a DEI style of thought in how they are pursuing their work in academia. You won't get hired unless you buy into a philosophy that is empirically shown to make you behave more like Stalin and Hitler. That's the facts. We have a hot box going on inside our universities, and it's actually deeply, deeply ironic. Because, first of all, let's go back to what DEI tries to assert. The idea is inclusion and equity means that your institution, your company, the government, your C-suite, your board of directors, it should look like the population at large. Well, the last time I looked, human society was roughly 50-50 male-female. So the headwaters of DEI, the universities, are now 60-40 female to male. That ain't inclusion. That ain't equity. That's something else. Whether that is good or bad or not is a question that, comes back to the question of why. Why is it happening? What does this mean for our society, for the people who are participating? And I think even more profoundly, what does it mean for the way men and women, our kids, future generations, interact with each other? The fact of the matter is that men and women are very, very similar, but we're not the same. We have different biases on average. We want slightly different things on average. And this is having a profound effect on these cornerstone institutions that impact all of us.
These changes reflect rising prioritization of egalitarianism, potentially at the expense of merit-based evaluations of science. In other words, these recent cultural trends in higher education are precisely what one would expect as women's representation in academia grows. Of course, this pattern of change in academia is also confounded by ideology. Women are generally more left-leaning than men, and equity and inclusion has become a major moral concern on the political left, with which academia is increasingly dominated.
Now, there's one other piece of the puzzle I want to point to before we move on, and that is that these differences in preference between men and women aren't just expressing themselves in participation in college, but they continue to express themselves in the majors that men and women study and focus on. And this has, again, a feedback loop into school and academia. This graph is one of these things that you have to really contend with if you want to call yourself social science. It's interesting and telling in ways that are provocative, but I think are worth focusing on. So along the vertical axis is average IQ, and along the horizontal axis is female to male ratio. So the further to the right you go, the more this field and the major is dominated by women, the further to the left, dominated by men. This is not a distribution of IQ of the sexes. It's not asserting that men are higher IQ than women. It's looking at who goes into what fields and what are they like cognitively. So to the top left, what you find are the stuff fields: physics, astronomy, materials engineering, electrical engineering, STEM, making stuff, looking at screens, working with things, trying to understand and study things, inanimate things. There's a simple, low-resolution saying about men and women that men are interested in things, women are interested in people. Again, these things are only best understood as like a low-resolution, blurry-eyed view of reality, but that is broadly, on average, true. When you go to the right, what you find is all the stuff related to school. All the teachers, all the future professors, all the future social workers, the future K through 12 educators, the early childhood development folks. They are down at the bottom right. Now, is IQ the most important thing to be concerned about? Not necessarily. It has implications for income. It has implications for cognitive processing, but you aren't a better or worse human being for having a higher or lower IQ. But this matters a lot for the nature of the education institutions we subject our kids to. And so what does this all add up to? You have, on one hand, a philosophy of fear and victimhood, the philosophy of essentially fight or flight. Oh, I have to be hyper-vigilant about your identity and be alert to the fact that you might be trying to oppress me. That's DEI. You then have the education institutions that we have been told we are supposed to support and valorize and subsidize to the tune of $1.5+ trillion in government subsidized, taxpayer subsidized student debt that has now become dominated by one sex, women, who on average are more hypervigilant about being victimized for reasons that are actually quite obvious. Women are more physically vulnerable than men. They are more subject to being assaulted than men. This is a fact. Men are more physically aggressive than women. That's why 95% of people in prison are men. There's reasons for these differences that are deeply ingrained in what and who and how we came to be what we are. But they're there and they're real. And science and the pursuit of truth, not just feelings, is about looking reality in the face and trying to understand it. But then over here, we have the hypervigilant worrywart women going into the fields that will teach the future generation of our kids and of women. And what do you know? The lessons from the failures of DEI apply to this, because hyper-focusing on our differences and on what we should fear makes us worse people. And so it isn't just the case that women are a bunch of commies. That's not true. What is happening is there's a toxic feedback loop that is sucking our daughters into a system that is setting them up for failure, that is setting them up for struggle and for struggle sessions. This is profoundly challenging for us as a people. We can't have this continue. As a parent, as a father, I don't want our daughters going into a world in which they are brainwashed into a system of victimhood that leaves them miserable and mentally damaged. And I don't want our boys going into an environment in which they feel entirely excluded from the things that are supposed to help them build their lives, and excluded from some of the milestones that their future mates are looking for in a mate. The math here is pretty crazy. On average, women want to marry men who are of similar or higher academic achievement than they are. So what happens when 60, 70, 75% of women have a higher degree of education, school credentials, let's say, than men? It's not good. It's not good at all. The DEI
vortex to hell
is upon us if we don't wake up and change direction profoundly in higher ed. It's great that the corporate sector is rejecting this stuff. They have profit and loss statements. They're rational, they're reasonable, and they're human because they're filled with people. The universities is a whole nother matter. K through 12 is a whole nother matter. It is going to be a much harder problem for us to solve. And if we don't, I think what happens in our culture is very, very toxic. This poor young woman, who's not even an American, she's a Brit, tweeted with pride about her success in getting her PhD for her doctoral thesis. Her doctoral thesis was the olfactory ethics, the politics of smell in modern and contemporary prose. So if you're like me, you see this and you think, you roll your eyes and say, that sounds like some commie gobbledygook. And it mostly is, because when you actually look at her abstract, it's not much better This thesis studies how literature registers the importance of olfactory discourse, the language of smell and the olfactory imagination it creates, in structuring our social world. The broad aim of this thesis is to offer an intersectional and wide-ranging study of olfactory oppression by establishing the underlying logics, plural, somehow, for some reason, that facilitates smell's application in creating and subverting gender, class, sexual, racial, and species power structures. Now, I'm reading all that and rolling my eyes and being dismissive because that is how I feel. And I think that's completely reasonable. This is commie gobbledygook. It's DEI nonsense. But this is a person. This young woman is a person. And the response to her happy face with her silly thesis that, might have all kinds of interesting stuff. I didn't read it, so maybe I'm just being totally unfair. But what's more unfair than me rolling my eyes is the response of the incel trolls on the internet. We will have to bleep this, but I will read it because it is shocking. And she retweeted this one, so it's one of the worst of the worst. You are the dumbest fucking bitch I have ever seen on the internet and the perfect example of literally everything wrong with modern society. Imagine thinking you deserve taxpayer money for writing up that useless piece of thesis nobody will ever read. Vegan, feminist, and queer, your dues to society are many, and me and the boys will rip them out of you. Not good. Remember that the DEI worldview promotes what? Promotes an authoritarian mindset, an ideology of punishment. Mr. Blub Blub, you are a woke asshole. And you have no idea what it means to be a man. And this comes back to why we're here, why it's Dad Saves America. America faces a masculinity crisis, and this is one example of it. Because real men don't talk to women that way. Fathers don't raise their sons to talk to women that way. If you want to be a knight, if you want to be a warrior, you defend women. It's called chivalry. And this is one of the things that this battle of the sexes that's playing out in our universities and has been playing out in this DEI pedagogy is destroying. And if we don't arrest this development, we are in for bad, bad times ahead. We should not valorize the institutions that give rise to any of this. I look at this young woman and I say, my first reaction should be as a human being, and then as a man, and then as a father. We are all people trying to figure out how to make it in this world. And to the extent she's maybe wasted her time on woke gobbledygook and wasted perhaps her high level of conscientiousness and her probably above average IQ on studying what might be nonsense, that sucks for her. That doesn't suck for me. That doesn't suck for you. Although it might suck for me and you if we've subsidized it, not in this case, but in general, she's kind of archetypal for what's going on. It sucks for her. It's not good for our girls to go into this environment in which they're trained in provable nonsense and harmed and come out the other end unhappy. It's not. And it's not going to make the world a better place to respond like children, like crude, de-evolved little boys throwing rocks. Frankly, like guys that don't know how to get laid. That's what's going on here. And we, the men in our society, need to stand up for healthy masculinity. And we need to confront as parents this DEI-generated nightmare that our kids face. This is the death spiral. That's what this is. This is starting from a bad idea, you end up in bedlam. You have a philosophy that promotes a war of all against all, and then you get a war of all against all. And I think we as men need to stand up for chivalry, for healthy adulthood, healthy masculinity, and not become woke assholes ourselves. Like, we can't do that. We can't let our kids do that. We can't let our sons become that, because they're not going to be happy and they're not going to find a woman. And our daughters need to be protected from this toxic waste ideology that is a vortex of despair and doom for them, a waste of time for their incredible potential and capabilities. This all has to go away. That's what has to come next. We need to build a new set of institutions. And that means we have to do something that's very expensive and difficult. And that is ask why. Why should I go to school? Why should I get a degree? Why? We have been running on fumes. We haven't been asking ourselves that question nearly enough. It is starting to change, but not fast enough. We need to all ask why. And the answer, because I did it, or because it's what is expected of me, is not a good answer. Not in a culture like this. We need to take a step back and reevaluate the premises of the things that we invest a lot of our time and money in. That is what the corporate sector is doing with DEI. That is what we all need to do with the source of DEI, higher ed. Because if we don't, I'm not sure we survive as a species. Because men and women, it takes two to tango, baby. And if we're not getting together in a complementary relationship, we are dying alone. What a terrible way to end. I'm sorry. Look, okay, here's the reason for optimism. I'll end on a high note. I think this is finally starting to change, and that is great. I think that the shift in our culture is starting to happen in a bigger, broader way than ever before. It is being recognized, including by the likes of MSNBC flip-flopping co-hosts, that this stuff has gone too damn far. And it's not good for anyone, especially the people it claims to help. And I think we have to put it in the ground for good. And the only way we do that is asking why over and over again until we get an answer that actually makes sense in our heads and our hearts. Promise and peril abounds, but what do you think? Let me know in the comments. I know you will. I'll be there waiting for you, and have a great weekend.